Good morning, or afternoon, I guess. How's everyone's semester, if you want to call it that, progressing so far? Everybody all right?
Pretty
Good. Going good.
Cool. All right. So, first things first. Questions. Does anybody have questions in particular on material, on requirements, on expectations? Has anyone actually excuse me, has anyone started on their bibliography yet?
Yes.
I have not yet.
All right.
I started researching about that, but I've never done one before, so that's it's just kind of new, I guess.
Right. While it shouldn't be new, this is something that you should have gotten in high school, but I understand that in Virginia that's not terribly common. So that makes it a very good exercise for us to do now while you're still in your the first phases of your undergraduate. And for any of you that are planning on going on to a 4-year, this is going to be vital, absolutely vital. For those of you that plan to kind of stick it out at the associate level, trust me, this is something that comes in handy even outside of school. So master this particular skill. It would be useful to you. Megan, I think it would probably be smart for us to speak for at least a couple minutes right after class, just to kind of, so you can ask your questions. Anything that wasn't answered in the first lecture, we can kind of try and see if we can get those worked out for you, okay? All right, not too bad. There have been, and I kind of have to just throw this disclaimer out now at the beginning of every session until the problem is solved, but there have been nothing but outage after outage after outage on Zoom over this first week, while pretty much every school in the world is starting their semesters using Zoom. So their servers are cracked. They're having a hard time. Actually, I shouldn't say that. Their servers are robust. It's just a lot of people all of a sudden that went from not using it to using it almost immediately. Excuse me, just one second. Nothing like a sudden doorbell just to kill your flow. All right, so let's go ahead and get started on the actual material. We only started to touch on things a little bit at the end of last class. We spent most of the time talking about class and how things are to progress. So we're going to spend a little bit more time, actually spend the rest of our time today, actually talking about philosophy. And specifically, we're going to focus a lot on kind of the core concepts in ethics and some of the tools that philosophy brings to the table that you need in order to understand how to engage with ethics in a rigorous and academic manner, right? mentioned last week, ethics is one of those subjects, right, that doesn't have something at the world that we can point at and says, this is why you should be a good person, right? We can give all kinds of reasons. We can like turn to transit. What's my word? Kind of otherworldly reasons. We can think of conceptual reasons, but there's no thing that we can point out in the world like there is with physics, right? Where we can say, let's do an experiment and see what happens when I manipulate this particular law of physics. Now, there's lots of things that we can do in the world for kind of getting a clue on what's the difference between when somebody acts well and when somebody acts like a jerk. But there's too much evidence in the world of people not acting well and acting like a jerk and still doing very well, right? So you can't just say, well, look, when we treat people nicely, or when we treat people with compassion, or when we treat people with respect, good things come to us. Because while that's generally true, there are enough examples of people not doing that and being successful that any attempt at pushing toward a scientific answer for why we should be decent human beings is going to run into trouble, right? So thinking about that, using the chat, I would like everyone to take a couple minutes and really think about why. Why do you think it is important to be a decent human being, to be a good person? To include, if it is your opinion that there is no reason to be a good person, voice it, right? This is a, to use modern terminology, this is a safe place, right? All of you should have read all the announcements, right? Yeah, right. If you read all the announcements, you know that the respect clause for this class is huge, right? I will remove you from the class if you're disrespectful. We just don't have any kind of room for people to be jerks when it comes to someone taking a position and then maybe the position is not one that you agree with. Maybe the position is one that changed from the last time that person had taken a position. This is the place to do that. Take a position on things. See what happens. Think about it from that perspective. And if you can't come up with a good reason for that position, change your position. That's how the world's supposed to work. This whole idea that consistency of our viewpoint, our point of view in the world, should always remain exactly the same, even in light of new evidence, is ridiculous, right? If you have the right kind of reasons to change your mind and you don't, it's not being consistent, it's being illogical, right? It's counterfactual to your reason. So don't do that. And in this class, be respectful of people's positions. That doesn't mean you have to agree with it, and it also doesn't mean that you have to take that position as worthy or respectable or anything like that. If somebody takes a position that perhaps has perhaps a hateful message or something like that, you don't have to stand for those kinds of things. You just have to be respectful in dealing with it, right? That said, there are definitely positions that are not open to discussion in the class, right? And hate discussions are the big one. So that's just the part of being respectful is that you don't use hate as your reason for anything. We're just not built that way. Okay? So take a few minutes, think about it, and then put your answers in the chat. I am perfectly okay with, though I don't think it's best, I'm perfectly okay with you using the private direct to me chat. That's okay if you're worried about everybody seeing what you have to say, but I would prefer that it is a discussion, right? That it's amongst everybody. So in these kinds of like to the class questions, we do not progress until everyone has given it a try. So if you're sitting there kind of sandbagging, cut it out. All right. We're looking for 4 more. Be a long class. Getting some good stuff in here. Good. All right. Well, in the interest of me not wanting to sit here and stare at the screen for an hour, we'll go ahead and move forward. So, some good stuff, right? Sometimes we think that maybe it's the right thing to do because we're rewarded for it. We get a little something out of it, right? The idea that being a good, oh wow, I just realized I didn't have my camera on, sorry. Oh, see why now. Hopefully this was correct for you. Sorry about the haze. I am your force ghost for today, I suppose. All right. So the idea of building relationships is the key component of one of the theories that we're going to look at when we talk about care ethics later on in the term. That's what we're doing. We're focused on relationship building, right? Positive relationship building. The idea that it's the right thing to do because that's what we were taught as children, or because that is what we are taught in our religious studies, or what we are taught by people that we care about and respect, right? These kinds of things. Lots of reasons that we might feel like, if I had to come up with a reason for being a good person, what would I say that would be convincing? Is it more convincing to say, I think it's important to be a good person because I just think it's right? It's hard to be convincing with something like that. How do you bring someone over to your point of view if you can't share your point of view? You don't have something you put together in that way. That's part of what the exercise in philosophy is all about, is learning how to articulate your ideas that don't have those nice concrete things that you could point at and say, fact 1, fact 2, fact 3, experiment 1, experiment 2, experiment 3. Even in things like sociology and psychology, where our sciences are dealing with circumstances in which the rules don't really apply in the same way, is kind of important. to know that they're still doing things in a manner that is scientific, because they have that option. They can work with something like, say, statistics. You can't work with statistics in philosophy. It doesn't work that way. You can't work with statistics in ethics specifically, because, again, it doesn't work that way. How do we deal with situations in which different cultures have different ethical stances? How do we deal with circumstances where we see the things that we think of as rewards for being a good person being heaped on people that are not good people, right? How do we deal with situations in which we have contradictory ethical systems and ethical standards and morals, individual morals? How do we deal with all that stuff when we're trying to articulate in some kind of scientific manner why it's important to be a good person? So let's start with that. First, in order for you to be a good person, you have to value being a good person. We talked about at the end of last class the concept of values versus ethics versus morals, right? In order for ethics to work, it also has to be one of your values, right? If someone sees ethics as work, as something that is tedious and non-conducive to them enjoying their life in some way or having a good life, then a lot of times what will happen is that, for one, they'll fail more often than not, or they'll, at the point at which it matters most, they will follow through, right? So they'll be this is your fair weather friend types, right? People who are good people all the way up until it matters, and then the minute that it matters, all of a sudden we have someone who's more than happy to just take a giant dump on everybody. So we have to be kind of careful about that sort of thing, right? Like taking on values until it becomes valueless. So you have to value being a good person. You have to want it. And that's an important part of this class. Understanding that being a good person is not something that I can teach you, right? I can give you tools. I can show you points of view. And I can bring into bear all kinds of methodology that you can use to be consistent and considerate. But I can't tell you in any kind of robust way, be a good person, right? Without making it just an out and out request or command. I can't say, be a good person and here's why. You have to want it. If you want to be a decent human being, there's all kinds of stuff in ethics that is available to you to help that happen. Because a lot of times, there are people who want to be good people, but just don't know how, right? The world's against them. Well, if I do this, but everybody else is doing that, then what's the point? What's the point in me being a good person if everybody else is just bending me back towards being selfish? And we have to kind of keep that in mind, right? Vast majority of human beings are good people, but that survival instinct is still strong. We're going to talk about that at length in a couple of weeks. We're going to talk about tribal ethics and evolutionary ethics and kind of how people are hardwired. But we have to understand that, like, generally, because of our mentalities, those pre-built instinctual mentalities, we do tend towards being cooperative, right? If we tend towards being cooperative, then there's obviously some kind of ecological benefit to that. So we can't point at that. We can say, well, look, we evolved in this way. Well, okay, why? What is it about human beings that are so dependent on other human beings that we would develop this kind of evolutionary point of view? And also, why is it so common for there to be people who don't follow that particular point of view? We'll talk about that later. But you still have to want it, right? You have to want to be a good person. If you want to be a good person, this class is going to be great for you. If you don't want to be a good person, there's nothing I can say to you to change your mind, right? I can give you reasons. I can talk all day about all of the benefits to others. But if you're in it for a reward for yourself, there are, I should stress that right away, there are lots of benefits to a person for being decent, right? Now, I want to actually caveat a little bit on my terminology when I'm talking about what it means to be a good person. So being a good person, small g good, that isn't very meaningful. The word good has so many meanings in the English language that it's sort of difficult for us to kind of nail it down. If I were to ask for a definition of good in the context of, an ethical human being, what would that mean? And the definitions are pretty broad and stretched. So much so that even within the field of ethics, even within the concepts in philosophy, we consider the definition, the hard definition of good, to be something that is an open question, right? What is important isn't so much that you know what the definition of good is, but that you have enough of a definition of what good is for us to progress forward. And generally, sorry, just got a ping email really quick that threw off my train of thought. What was that? What was the last thing I just said? Somebody help me out. My brain is a big block of Swiss cheese. It's awesome. Thank you, Armin, for that. Open question. That was it. Okay. Open question. So the idea is this. You need to know enough about what it means to be a good person, to be able to progress forward, and then we work out what our definition is as we're moving through the process of developing what it means, right? Or what it means for us. That has a lot of import for what it is that we're doing. Kind of working towards a definition of good is what allows us to progress. If we tried to come in with a hardcore definition of what's good in this sense, we're going to get stuck on it. It's going to become a sticky point, and we're not going to be able to move forward, right? So we definitely don't want to do that, right? We don't want to get stuck because we're focused on this one thing rather than being able to move. So generally, most people understand what it means to be a good person, at least in general, right? This means things like not being selfish and not being cruel and not being, does everybody in here know the definition as opposed to the colloquial use of the term dastardly? What does it mean to be dastardly? Anybody want to stab at that? Because oddly enough, a term that has technical definition in addition to kind of the way that it's used in cartoons.
Did you say dastardly?
Yeah.
Like wicked or cruel?
Yeah, that's a pretty good straight off synonym-based definition. You'll find that definitions come in three forms, right? We have explanatory definitions, we have synonymous definitions, and then we have gauge or example-based definitions, right? So when you use a series of other words to kind of allude to a word, that's called a synonymous definition. So wicked and cruel, vicious, hateful, even sometimes used is what a lot of times are used as synonyms for dastardly. But dastardly itself is, for one, it's an adjective, right? So it's meant to kind of modify another term. In this case, in philosophy, we use it to modify a person, right? So you can't have a dastardly dog like the cartoon. And you can't have like a dastardly device or you can't have a world event that is dastardly. People can be dastardly. And it's used because the word evil carries such a weird connotation in our language, right? Evil was the term that was used for a couple thousand years, and then roughly around the time that people started really engaging with philosophy in the modern era, roughly in the 1700s, the word evil had taken on such a religious connotation that it was difficult to say evil and people not think of supernatural effects and entities, right? So I can help you out with the spelling part. So it, by definition, for philosophers, is the word that we use when we are classifying a human being as non-religiously evil, right? So this has nothing to do with some kind of otherworldliness or supernaturalness. It's just a bad person, right? So dastard, I use that term a lot. You'll get used to it. And sometimes it catches people up because they're so used to its cartoon or kind of almost comedic usage. But for us, it's important word, right? So being dastardly, being evil, is not something that learning ethics is ever going to cure, right? You need something a little more fundamental. So if you're someone that just has an evil streak, learning ethics is one step, assuming that you want to change it all. But the desire to change, and usually it requires some kind of life event. You know, this is a popular theme in movies, right? You have the reformed person, right? The person who is evil or cruel or wholly selfish or something along those lines, who suddenly has some horrible event happen to them, and all of a sudden they want to be good people again, right? Now, I should stress that being dastardly is work in the same way that being ethical is work. It's hard for us to kind of move away from our psychology, our instincts. So to be more good than our instincts, which is generally the goal, right? We want to be more good than our instincts. Our instincts all too often drive us towards selfishness. That being above that requires effort. It's the same kind of process in order to be below that, right? You have to be a particular kind of person with a certain set of values in order to be truly dastardly, right? And it's unfortunately true that there are people that are like that, and all too often we like to try and get our heads wrapped around that by saying, oh, it's because they have some kind of mental illness or because there was something in their upbringing that, for all intents and purposes, broke them. Well, that second part is true. It can be part of their upbringing, and that might give us reason to understand it. But that's also true the other way, right? People who really want to work hard at being a good person do so because of something in their background. Very few people just come right out of the gate pushing towards that attempt at excellence, right? So we'll learn when we start talking about Aristotle, the concept of goodness is excellence. And since that generally is the theory that I'm most aligned with, I use that terminology a lot. So just a little kind of idea of our direction of travel. We're talking about excellence. Excellence being, in order to be an excellent human being, you have to be a good person, right? That's part of being an excellent human being. It's not all there is, but it is a big part of it. All right, so being dastardly requires effort. You have to want it. You have to want to be evil in order to be evil. most people who don't align with the good, capital G, tend to be selfish rather than evil, right? If you consider something like being a good person as someone who's willing to put the needs and wants of others above themselves, or if they're willing to self-sacrifice for some kind of greater good, as we will come to a definition of, et cetera, et cetera, then dastardly is someone who wants the opposite of it, right? These are people who are willing to put people in bad situations, or who will actively be cruel for the sake of being cruel, right? People who take pleasure in the can't just use pain, right? It's not just pain. Sometimes it can just be in the misery or in the suffering of others, right? Now you have to be careful, right? Just taking a little bit of pleasure in someone else's misery doesn't make you an evil person. Everybody has a little taste of that, right? It's kind of part of being human. We, sometimes like to suck, and it can be a kind of catharsis. Anybody here not know what the word catharsis means? That comes up often enough. That's a good question, Sarah. I'll get to that in a second. Has anyone not heard the word catharsis? Use your thumbs up if you've not ever heard that word before. I'll type it in. So. It's often used when we talk about fiction. So whether movies or books or stories. So everybody's heard the word, at least. I'm not going to go too far into this, but it's kind of important in the sense that it kind of gives us an idea of why we can occasionally find a little joy in somebody else's pain, right? Catharsis is the idea that in our suffering, any effect that can be brought upon, or brought upon probably isn't the right way to put that, but any effect that we can experience in the world vicariously, not in person, but through someone else, that alleviates some of our suffering, is kind of by default pleasurable. So if we see somebody who's really hurting, we can look at them and say, that's not me, right? Even if we're suffering in our own ways, we can say, that isn't me. And because that effect is being kind of projected onto someone else, you're living it vicariously, there's a pleasure in it, right? There's a kind of immediate sense of relief, right? At least that's not me. So catharsis is kind of an important part of those moments when we find a little bit of joy in other people's suffering. It's when you do it without the catharsis, that you do it just for fun, that it becomes problematic, right? Right. In that same way, like, thank goodness that's not me. Now, this is not a kind of situation we would want to create, right? That's the difference between the dastardly and the normally selfish, right? We might see catharsis through fiction. The vast majority of human beings get most of their catharsis through fiction, even if it's entirely internal. You might create scenarios in your mind where it's like, that could have been a lot worse. Could have been this or that or this or that. Yep, exactly. So we get a lot of it through fiction. We watch a movie, somebody has a really bad time, but in the end, maybe the the good wins. So we have both our catharsis and our hope all projected into this one scenario, and that can have some pretty strong effects, right? So, Sarah asked the question, why do you think people want to become dastardly? Well, we can kind of answer this question from two directions. On the first hand, we can just ask the question, well, why do people want to be good? Right? And we have quite a few reasons that people have thrown out why people might want to be good. There's a lot of the same kind of stuff that can be said about why people would want to be dastardly just by turning it around. But more often than not, people want to be dastardly because they themselves find pleasure in it, right? Doesn't have to be the case. It could be purely driven by a kind of habit, right? Perhaps the causing of pain was something that started to develop when they were very young and has just become a habit. It's how they think the world works. And once something becomes a habit like that, you see it in everything. So someone who is like truly dastardly has become habituated to the idea that there's evil in the world and therefore they should be a creator of that, right? Very seldom is it academic though. Not many people decide that they want to be dastardly and then start working toward it. In the same way that a lot of people don't think, I want to be a good person. What do I do? Right? Most people just try to get by, being the best person that they can be. Yep. So a bully is on that route to habituating a dastardly character, right? But that's not catharsis, right? Catharsis would be you watching a bully put somebody down and taking a little bit of pleasure in it because you're glad you're not the person being put down. So two different kind of scenarios. If you create the misery and take pleasure in it, it's no longer catharsis. It becomes something, right? It becomes evil. But if you see the misery and take pleasure in it, so long as it's not something that you could do something about, then that's generally it's just a thing. It's fairly amoral. It's when it starts to be something that you seek or something that you create, then it becomes problematic, right? Okay. So I was trying to do our attendance automatically, but apparently my password is no longer. Yeah, so my password expired. Give me like 3 minutes to create a new password. So I can actually get our attendance done. There it goes. The world we live in. the idea that this has always been something that kind of boggles me, right? From the perspective of an ethicist, someone who studies this sort of thing. The fact that you, as a decent, hardworking, reasonable human being, can get in trouble for not locking something just blows my mind, right? You're the one that's getting in trouble for someone else stealing your crap. What's the point? Where does that make sense? Always been one of those things that's been fun to contemplate. Not fun. BCCS is winning today. All right, I might have to do this manually if this doesn't resolve itself very soon. Okay, so this is going to be interesting. We will have probably 2 videos. That's been one of the challenges for this whole dropping problem with the Zoom. I probably talked a good couple of minutes, not realizing that I had been dumped from the system. So, what was the last thing you all heard?
I think you were just talking about the password.
Okay, all right. So we'd at least gotten that far. That's a plus. Okay, so the idea that somebody wants to be good or wants to be evil is kind of fundamental to understanding how ethics works, because we have to understand that ethics is only valuable to someone who wants it, right? So the takeaway of the last half hour's conversation is this: if you want it, there are tools that help it happen, right? If you want to be a good person, there are tools. There are probably tools out there for helping people who want to be dastardly too. I just don't know what they are. But both of them require effort. They require some degree of work, right? That being said, there is within both kind of values, whether it be good or evil, there is this kind of idea of order, right? Kind of this order versus chaos idea, right? Either side of this coin can seek order or just chaos, right? For anybody that plays role-playing games, this is probably going to be pretty apropos to something that you already know a little bit about. One of the things that's interesting about tools like that is that they sort of force you to take on new perspectives and new points of view. And sometimes, because they aren't real life, they can make certain points of view seem really appealing that aren't when you start having to actually interact with people. So be careful of that sort of thing. That said, order, the idea that we want things to be consistent, can be something that is practiced both by people who seek to be decent and by people who seek to be dastardly. And one of the things, this goes back to Sarah's question, one of the things that some people choose to be dastardly about is the kind of the attempt to create in a sense, a kind of order, a world that makes sense, that kind of follows a particular kind of set of rules or structures. So the idea, if you've ever heard the term rule by fear, right, is one of those kind of concepts. If you think ruling by fear is the right way to get people to act, then that's a dastardly direction, right? But it doesn't mean it's not effective, right? People have done this and have practiced this in real life and have created, in effect, a society, if you will, or something along that line, that was orderly, even if it wasn't very comfortable, right? Even if it wasn't something in which people were able to flourish, even if it was one in which people suffered. At least it was orderly. Most of the time, dastardly people see themselves as the pinnacle, right? They don't realize what it's like to not be the pinnacle, right? So it's all about trying to achieve the pinnacle, becoming the top of the pile, if you will. You want to be the dictator. You want to be the king. You want to be whatever. You want to be in charge. And most actions prior to that will be about that, seeking power. And once you've found power or achieved power, then it's all about keeping power, right? You could say that ethics, both positive and negative, have a little bit to do with power. Being a good person, if you're being a good person because you think it makes other people better, that's a kind of power, right? Not sure what the electronic sound is. Nobody's talking, so I can't, except for me. All I hear is my own voice. But kind of, again, Sarah's question, there's a new one. So should there be a clean definition of what is good or bad? Well, oddly enough, we're going to have 16 weeks to answer that particular question, right? And what we're going to find out is that there is definitely a difference between what we consider to be the definition of good and what we consider to be how to act good, right? We're going to be focusing on that part, the normative ethics. Okay, we're going to throw out another definition word, right? Or word in need of definition. What does the term normative mean? Good. Good. So a couple of you have like already a working kind of concept of this. What should be? Normative is what should be. So a concept or a kind of reality that is normative is one in which it guides people towards what should be. Sometimes normative concepts are what we call realized, right? So a normative concept in our world is one in which you have to eat, right? Hunger is normative. For the most part, in well-developed parts of the world, that's not really an issue, right? You should eat, and you do eat, and therefore you survive, right? And things move forward. But there's a whole lot of shoulds out there that aren't realized. Ethics is one of the big ones. Normative ethics is one of the big ones, in the sense that there's a lot of shoulds out there that are, some of them are almost right on the borderline of being unachievable. And then some of the theories that we're going to be working with, these are concepts that shouldn't be achievable, right? So there's a normative should and a normative shouldn't in this case. If it is something where we can achieve the end result, it means we have nothing further to strive for, and we need to change our goalpost, right? This is a big deal in virtue when we start talking about virtue ethics. The idea that there's always a better you on the horizon is important, right? It's effort. We need effort. Normativity as a standard is a good way. Another good way of thinking about it. A standard is something that is meant to be attained and maintained, right? So we have to reach the standard, and then we have to stay there at the minimum. If you think of normativity in that way, we see that same kind of requirement for the should, right? This is where we should be, at least, right? Anything above that is above and beyond, and that's great, but this is where we should be. So we might have some ethics, like, say, virtue theory, who think that we should always be progressing, but I'll tell you, the vast majority of human beings would be perfectly happy with us setting an ethical standard and sticking to it. That'd be awesome. If we could get to that point, whew, that'd be cool. So, that is basically a gigantic caveat. All right, we've got this gigantic caveat that we live in a world in which the idea of people being good is a world in which there is a good, right? And that in order to get there, we have to want it. It doesn't help us at all to learn, to kind of force our way into one of these theories if we don't have any value there, right? Okay, so these are all what we call metaethical concepts. We've been talking about it to this point. Metaethical concepts are all the pieces and parts that make ethics work. Values are the other direction, right? So metaethics are the pieces and parts that make ethics work. Ethics itself sits in the middle, and then values are all the things that we find valuable. In philosophy, we call it value theory. Value theory includes things that don't have any kind of moral components, right? So we might think of things like art and beauty and the natural environments and these kinds of, we might find all of these things valuable, and there not be any kind of normative aspect to them, no ethical aspect to them. So we get value theory, and then ethics, or more specifically ethical theory, and then metaethics is the smallest. Metaethics are all those parts that make your engine work. Values are the car. We're going to be talking about the engine, right? To kind of play around a little bit with metaphor. So we're going to be working with the engine. But we need to have some of these metaethical concepts down in order for that to be of any value to us whatsoever. Okay? So the nuts and bolts, that's going to be all these things like consistency, integrity, definition. Those are going to be all our nuts and bolts. Morals are going to be our fuel. These are this is the stuff that we pour into the engine to make it work. We will talk quite a bit about moral metaethics as we move through the course, because there's going to be a lot of our theories that we're going to be working with that bring their own fuel. But the pieces and parts will still be the same, right? So all those nuts and bolts will still be the same. You still need to have a concept of the good. You still need to have something like a value that pertains to that particular theory, so on and so forth. You still need all those pieces. but the fuel is going to change. And from right this moment until the end of the class, you're going to have a chance to look at a lot of different kinds of fuel, right? So right now, the jumble of morals that you have that are all locked up inside your brain may or may not, but probably it's much more likely that they don't have any kind of chain that connects them all together. They're these little disparate chunks that float around from various different sources. And like I said last class, a lot of them are going to be contradictory, right? Give me an example of a contradictory moral. Give me two morals that you have that don't work together. Everybody's got at least one set. I'll type up one of my own. Right? Metaethics is the nuts and bolts. The engine is what we're going to be talking about. That's the normative ethic. Okay, so here's an example of two morals that I hold that are contradictory. I think people are people, and they're all worth consideration. Every single one of them, equal consideration. From criminals to saints. But I also hold that as a father and as a spouse, I have responsibilities and duties toward my family. Right? So, under the grounds of my first moral, my family has the same moral worth as everybody else. But my second moral means that I'm going to be much more likely to throw that first moral out the door if put in a situation in which I have to choose. Right? It's just an example. There are tons like that. So, back to it. Let's see some conflicting morals that you might have. If it helps, one of the sources of conflicting morals often comes between the existential and the social, right? To put that in plain English, between the world that you live in and either your religious or spiritual life, right? So you might have something that is a a religious moral, and then a moral about what it means to be a person who lives in a society, a good person who lives in a society, and those two things might not work well together. Perfect. Yeah, exactly. It's a great one. We often, a lot of times when we run into these, it's because we have one moral that is this massive blanket that just covers so many kinds of circumstances. And then we have all these caveats, little pieces and parts that give us reason to ignore the first. So another way of saying this is lying is morally wrong. Protecting someone's health is morally right, right? So the situation would be, well, what if you have to lie in order to protect someone's health? Now you have a conflict of morals. Right? Good. Stealing comes up a lot. And the reason for that is that stealing, as a general rule, is simply a kind of, it's too nebulous, right? Because there's no context. Stealing just from the kind of from this conceptual point of view is just about taking something that isn't yours, that you don't have the right to possession of, right? But there's a lot of people out there that have a lot more than other people. What if somebody got something because they stole it? Are you allowed to steal it back? So on and so forth. So yeah, stealing is a big one. Lying's huge. We'll talk about lying quite a bit in, I guess it would be week 9, not week 10, week 8 and week 10. Torrance Leon? Is Abby Miller on? Right. So do you prefer Catherine or is Cassie okay? Do you have a preference for your if you use a nickname or not?
Kat is okay. Catherine, Kathy doesn't matter.
Okay, fair enough. All right. So the two conflicting morals here are survival versus courage, right? And then the situation is choosing your life over another. Like, if you were in a situation in which it's your life or someone else's life, how do you choose? something like murder should be punished might be one moral. Death of killing another human being is bad should be another moral. And then the situation is okay. So how do you deal with a murder, especially one that you know will happen again? So again, killing is wrong. Showing mercy is good. So which do we do if the only mercy we can show is through killing? Not quite sure where you're going with that, Felicia. Can you expand on that a little bit? Were you responding to someone else's, or are you kind of setting up your quandary?
I was responding because I was on jury duty one time, and somebody was up on a trial, and we had to choose, but I didn't think the person did it. But I had to go with the majority. I didn't really, but in jury duty, it's really hassling sometimes. So I just thought I was caught in a situation that I didn't think the person did it, but others did. So I was almost forced to choose to think that way that they were thinking.
Okay. So we have two morals there, right?
Yeah.
That we should use our best judgments when we're making judgments of others, and that we should appreciate and take into consideration the judgments of others. These are the two ways of thinking about the world, right? Should I care about what other people think? Should I care about what other people think is right or is good?
Right.
So there's a difference between, I saw peer pressure pop up. There's a difference between peer pressure, groupthink, and social thinking, right? Peer pressure is where this sounds a little bit more kind of the direction that you were speaking from, Felicia, is this kind of idea that you felt obligated to think of it. That's a kind of peer pressure scenario. Groupthink is where you start off with no opinion and then take on the opinion of the majority without necessarily critically engaging with it, right? That's a kind of groupthink. And social thinking is where you have an idea about something, but then you, on investigation of the kind of wider elements, like what other people think, you start to realize there were things that you weren't necessarily taking into consideration, or that there's good reason for you to change your position over to what has the stronger social impact.
Okay.
Right. So these are three ways that you might change your mind about what you think is right or wrong versus what other people think is right or wrong. You might do it because you feel an obligation. You might do it because you didn't really have an opinion. And it's, I hate to use the term easier because that makes it sound lazy. It's easier to just take on what other people think is right and wrong.
Okay.
Right? Both of those have negative components. The third one is generally just considered to be the best, but it doesn't mean it's the only one, right? It's just the best of them. And that's if you have a concept about the world, and upon investigation of what other people think, it opens the door towards other points of view for you. Changing your mind at that point becomes it's a choice. It's a deliberative choice.
Okay.
As opposed to the other two, which feel less choice-based.
Okay.
Yeah, this is great. law is a good example because following the law itself isn't necessarily an ethical concept, but thinking that it is important, that it is valuable to follow the law, that's an ethical concept, right? Can we see the difference between that? Following the law and thinking it's good to follow the law are different on a fundamental level. Following the law isn't really something you have a lot of choice in most of the time. Going against the law is something that should be every time a deliberative choice. We shouldn't habitually or kind of nonchalantly break the law. When we do break the law, it should be something that we do because there is a very good reason for it. But that's contradictory to the idea that it is important to follow laws. So there's a difference between opportunities past and opportunities future, right? So it is perfectly compatible to say that I think people deserve equal opportunity from the perspective of everyone should have the same starting point, right? And then to say that through your own actions, you might limit the opportunities available to you. This doesn't have to be necessarily criminality or something negative, right? Just by making a choice. So I chose to enter the Army right out of high school, which meant that opportunities to go to college had to be put to the wayside. It's not that those opportunities were lost to me in some weird esoteric way that they were taken, but I made a choice. I followed one of the opportunities I had available and went on to follow that particular opportunity path. So from that perspective, there's going to be times where opportunities are a starting point, and then you choose one of those opportunities, and then all those others are lost to you. But not because somebody took them, because you made a choice. So having equal opportunity at the starting gate is important. That is something that's absolutely fundamental to human rights, right? We'll talk about human rights later on. Absolutely fundamental to human rights. And the fact that we don't have that in our world right now is a massive injustice. But what people choose to do with their life once those opportunities that they do have are presented are going to fundamentally limit the number of opportunities they have after making those choices. So if you choose the life of a criminal, a lot of your opportunities are going to dry up very quickly. And that not be contradictory, right? The hard part becomes defining the starting point. So at what point should there be equal opportunity? If we're talking about, say, a job announcement and the hiring process for that one job, should everybody have the same opportunity to get that job? Well, yes and no. Everybody that is equally qualified should have equal opportunity to that job, but you can still only give it to one person, right? So is it taking away someone's or somebody's opportunities because they weren't the one that got chosen? Now we're assuming all things being equal, that everybody has the same qualifications and no one is being judged for something outside of their qualifications. The minute we start throwing those things into the mix, we change the scenario quite a bit, right? So if I'm only allowed to hire one person, but I hire them because they're white, now I've taken someone's opportunities, right? Now I've done something evil. Not making the choice based on the criteria of the requirements for that job or whatever it is. Did I miss you, Gary? Oh, that's right. You did tell me last week that you went by trade. Sorry about that. Glad you caught it.
No worries. I just got the notification, so I was just not trying to interrupt class. So I was just letting you know.
Well, it's actually kind of good that you mentioned that because we should be interrupting class about 8 minutes ago. You guys are going to have to keep me honest on this. Normally, these lectures are 2 hours. Okay? So cutting them in half and doing them twice a week instead of the single one means that you're getting a half hour extra each week of filler, and a lot of that time is going to be spent regurgitating old stuff, which can lead to rambling on. So you're going to have to keep me honest when it comes to class times. Okay, so that's it for now. Next week we will start talking about normativity and the concept of ethics as theory, right? What's the difference between ethics, this big fabulous thing, and ethics as theory, right? Yeah. All right. So thanks everybody. I'll see you next Monday.
Thank you.
See ya. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Did you want that to be private, Justin? No, because I have a couple of things that I can talk with Megan about as well. I think between the two of you, maybe we can, unless it's something more personal.
Not at all. I missed the first
Okay, so yep, yeah. we're in a similar set of circumstances, so that works out. Okay, so week 1 is for one, it's a long week. I do that on purpose because of the weirdness with TNCC loving to just start the semester in the middle of the week. It's just kind of it's a little whack. And since I teach in multiple schools in the BCCS system, it always just throws things off. So you get your first week has 10 days instead of 7. So you have a little bit of leeway from last Wednesday to kind of get by. Now, I'm assuming all of you have watched the video, right, from Monday.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of that, as you can see by that, a lot of it was discussion about expectations and tools for accomplishing their tasks. All right. The value, of course, of being in the class at the time was that questions could be asked, right? Clarifications could be made. So that's what we're going to do for you now. Is we're going to, you got all the expectations, all that stuff got signed into you through the video. So what we're going to deal with then is questions. What challenges do you face? Have you started putting anything together that has caused you some pain? Was there something that was difficult to understand about the video, etc.? So fire away. What are your questions?
You can first.
I just wanted to like double check because I saw that you had posted a roll call attendance to our grades. So and it's like 100 points for the roll call. It's not.
Yeah, it's based on percentage. The percentage isn't worth anything. So there's no negative grade that you're going to get from absences or attendance. That said, I do use attendance to tweak. So if you're at 89.8 and you need that bump to 90, then attendance will get you there, right? If you're at that kind of teeter point between failing and not failing, attendance will get you there, right? If you need that little bit of a benefit of the doubt because you missed a really important class, but we did something in class, attendance will get you that little extra. Just to, if you missed 7 classes and then you show up and say, "Oh, on the 8th class that I missed, some dastardly thing happened," right? And you go, okay, whatever. But if you've been great about attendance and then all of a sudden you have an emergency, well, so be it. Then let's get to work finding a way for you to make up whatever you need to get. Now that being said, when it comes to attendance, the vast majority of my communication with the class is going to be here, right? I try to stay on top of the Canvas messages.